Hello, it's Thomas Keneally here. It's an honour to talk to you. I'm talking to you from the Tom Keneally Centre. I became a writer in, I suppose, 1964 when I was first published, long time ago. Of course, I'd written the novel earlier than 1964, and like a lot of people, I was a bit of a misfit. I'd studied for the priesthood. I felt failure leaving that. I had very little social life, plenty of time to write, you would say. And so over the Christmas holidays one year, I wrote a novel, and then I continued to write it for another number of months, simply sent it to the address inside the copyright page of a particular book, and the British publisher called back and said they were going to publish it. Australia then, there wasn't a visible literary community. There wasn't a society of authors. There weren't festivals. I had no one to tell me that I shouldn't become a full-time writer, and so I decided that that was what, above all things on earth, I wanted to be. And I then wrote a second book about childhood. Childhood's always a very big issue. Often first books are, as mine was, a mixed up one about adolescence, the next book about childhood, and then the next was a significant book called Bring Larks and Heroes, which was really published all over the world. Many translation contracts. In those days, I have to say, translation was easier to get than it is now. And I felt that I was a writer and was very grateful to be. I felt that with an Australian publisher, a British publisher, a US publisher, I could put together 3 pittances and they would add up to a living. I was a very dark young man when I started writing, and out of that darkness, I suppose, came Bring Larks and Heroes and the Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith. When I wrote the Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, I was still youngish and had early 30s and had little kids and a wife, and I was beginning to emerge. But I was very angry, and have been all my life, about the physical conditions in which Aboriginals have lived, in blacks' camps on the edge of town, peripheral people wandering into town, bringing the diseases with them, the infections with them, which derive from the poor sanitation, the poor water supply, the poor sewage with which the camps were fitted out. And so I have my next book out will be about Mungo Man, a fictional version of Mungo Man, who lived 42,000 years ago. So if you want to call me a historical novelist, you can, but I'm very happy to be. But 42,000 years is really pushing out the envelope of history. So I've always been concerned with that Aboriginal issue, always been concerned about the periphery of society because I was born on it, always been concerned about hysteria. There was great anti-Irish hysteria when I was young, if you can believe it, before U2 and before all the great Irish writers emerged. There were already great Irish writers, but they were claimed by the English. And it was hard for anyone with an Irish name to get just any job they liked. And there was active prejudice. And so that little bit, it was minor prejudice. It was the occasional slur. And it's the sort of thing that when immigration started post-war, transferred itself to the newcomers and left us alone. But I knew just enough discrimination for it to be useful to me for my writing career. I think of that movie Jurassic Park, where Spielberg gets, theoretically, the DNA out of a dinosaur out of a mosquito encased in amber. And he uses that DNA to recreate the dinosaurs. Well, I used my small mosquito bite of discrimination, of prejudice, to allow me to write about these issues. So a lot of my work has been about love across or fraternity across the boundaries of race and culture. In the notorious case of Schindler, which isn't my best novel, but is the one by which I'm measured, merely because it was abetted by the film industry. The film industry is a saviour and, to an extent, an expropriator of the novel. But if they make good films, of course, it's a servant of the book industry. But that was a bit uncharacteristic of me, in that I had to write it like Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, and rather like The Right Stuff by Tom Wolfe. I couldn't make anything up. Everything I made up was in the interpretation and in recording conversations that Schindler himself recorded, or the prisoners themselves remembered. I let myself go there, as faction writers do. So it was like Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. It was a sort of documentary novel, but I did hope that it had enough perception in it, and enough characterization, and enough nuance to make it more than non-fiction, to make it a novel, to make it, to put it up there with In Cold Blood. The reason I couldn't change any the facts egregiously, as we do in novels normally, was that the people gave me their interviews on condition that I showed them what I'd written. And they wanted it to be correct. And they corrected it incident by incident, nuance by nuance. And they had the right to do that because it was their story. I've never written another book like that, but I think a lot of my books since Schindler are much better. There's a book called Woman of the Inner Sea, of which I'm kind of proud, and I have to say, narcissistically name-dropping. We're all narcissists, but we don't like to recognize it. But Hillary Clinton loved a book of mine called 3 Cheers for the Paraclete, and on the strength of it invited myself and my life partner, my wife Judy, to the White House for dinner. So the most extraordinary things can come from what you write now, the most extraordinary, unsuspected developments. And then I wrote a novel about famine and war in East Africa called Tu Asmara. And again, I found that it was used by UN observers at African elections. And that was better than selling millions upon millions. That was better than being Dan Brown, to see people in the business. Donald Horne always said, he was an Australian writer, he always said, the most important thing with your book is to influence the influencers, to influence opinion by influencing the people who make opinion. And I think that's a very important point, and that's what we should first do, and hope that the process will give us a living when we become writers. My most recent books, I'd say one of my best books is a book called The Daughters of Mars, about two sisters who become nurses in World War I. Now, it is not that Madonna of the trenches kind of treatment of the nurses. It is about their fight against sexism. It is about their fight for dignity. And it is to study something that fascinates me about women, their capacity to multitask, and how things can be so serious that in life sometimes that they don't panic and they don't, as men do, they're not sick as men are. I've seen it with my wife in the war in East Africa, that she could handle easily stuff that I couldn't, big emergencies. And I wanted to write about the capacity of these women to deal with an endless tide, an unremitting tide of traumatized physically and mentally boys aged between 17 and 25, and process them medically every 2 or 3 times a week over 2 days. I wanted to write about that, and it was intended to be something about what I've found out, being, I hope, a reformed sexist, about women, and then this degree of capacity and multitasking that they indubitably have. Then there's a novel called Napoleon's Last Island. I really like it because there was a family of English, a young family on St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic when Napoleon went there as a prisoner of the British. And he lived in their summer house for some months. And he became so close to them that they got into trouble with their own government. And they were tossed off the island in 1818. They were brought to England, kept under supervision. They were in a shameful condition, under surveillance from the high Tories of the day. We've got our high Tories now, and you know what poisonous creatures they are. And ultimately, he did a favour for the government, and the whole family was sent to Australia with their Napoleonic memories and memorabilia. So you had a family that meets a political prisoner on a small island in the middle of the Atlantic, and because of that, they ultimately get sent to the largest island in the world, and under a cloud. Not convicts, but under a cloud. And I love those nuances and echoes. I've always loved the relationship between Australia and the old world. I've never seen Australia as discrete unto itself as some Australian writers have. And I've been criticised frequently for this. These sort of attitudes have vanished in this generation, in this literary generation, and you're allowed to write about whatever you like. And I've always thought of Australia as coming from the world and then going back for special purposes, notably for world wars, as my father did. So receiving Nazi memorabilia in Australian Comforts Fund cake tins when I was 7, I'm sure had an impact on my sense that we were part of the world, that we were not discreet. And I think that also gave me the confidence to be a writer, because I became a writer like some of my contemporaries, notably the great Frank Morehouse, in a time when Australia had great cultural inferiority. I even doubted when I was a kid whether Australians could write and whether the Australian landscape was amenable to poetry or prose, because everything we read at school was about hedgerows and little flowers and seasons of mist and mellow fruitfulness. We had no bloody seasons of mist and mellow fruitfulness. And I wondered, could we make a world out of the Australian experience? And that's what I've been doing, but also out of the human experience. I don't think you can say, just because we're at the end of the earth, we shouldn't be players in the business of the earth. And whenever Americans say to me, how come an Australian wrote Schindler's List? I say, I was closer to the Nazis than you were. My father was fighting them. Why shouldn't an Australian? We're part of the world too. And a number of contemporary authors of yours, of your generation, the younger generation, I imagine an ideal younger person out there looking at this, then in your generation, there is a greater sense of being part of the world, and people aren't persecuted for writing about other issues, other parts of the world. I would say keep writing. You know, I believe the subconscious, the collective subconscious, is involved in writing, and you only access it, that Jungian pit of wonder full of great archetypes and ideas. You only encounter it through the labour of writing. So if you're in doubt whether to start or do another writing seminar, start. You can always go to that seminar and amaze them with what you've written to this point. Another thing I've found is that my first drafts aren't very good, but you stick with them. You are working in darkness in the first draft. Now, we were told at school and university that the writer was very much in control. He sprinkled metaphors, similes, onomatopoeia. He chose a simile here, and he had a box of similes and a box of metaphors, and he consciously, with the front of his brain, fitted them together. As you know, if you write, you do these things by instinct and feel. You don't have a box of similes and metaphors. Actually, you do, but you're not conscious. It's the subconscious. And when you engage the subconscious and work your way through that first bit, the characters begin to relate to each other organically, and events begin to relate. So you have to be brave when you begin, because you'll feel like talking about your book in the pub or at dinner, but you won't feel like doing it when you get to the page. You just make yourself, if you could do 500 words a day, imagine how much you'd have by the end of the year. So good fortune to you, Australian writers out there, and thank you all you Australian readers, and I hope you all have happy lives with words.